This video is going to conclude our study of the absolute monarchs of Europe, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. In the previous video, we saw how Napoleon was able to rise up through the ranks of the French army and French politics. I was able to seize power and what he did inside of France for his domestic policies as leader of that country. What we're going to focus on here in this final video is what Napoleon is doing outside of France as he begins to expand the French borders, build up the French Empire, and see how that all comes tumbling down. So again, our focus is going to be on the military and foreign policies of Napoleon while he's in charge. Remember that Napoleon was able to rise through the ranks of the French army and thus gain a lot of political power because of the revolutionary wars that France is fighting during this time period, as conservative forces and foreign forces have invaded France to try to cut out and stop this virus of revolution from spreading across Europe. So there's already a lot of fighting that's going on. And what Napoleon has to do really is begin to stabilize France itself, and then he begins to go and look outwards. In 1801, France is going to defeat Austria, and this defeat of Austria is going to allow it to gain Italian territories, kind of the north of Italy, just over the Alps, as well as eastward into, again, German territories, German probably in quotation marks there. In 1802, France is going to sign the Treaty of Amiens with Britain. And again, this is going to set off a pretty, we're looking at, say, 15-year period of, from a grander 2023 standpoint, on and off fighting between France and Great Britain, with periods of peace and truce, as well as fighting. But basically, again, they're not going to be ever on good terms during this time period. So this is a temporary peace treaty with Britain, and it's going to very shortly kind of spill over even farther. Now, the first major battle we want to talk about when we're talking about with Napoleon is in 1805, and this is the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, important for context, this is going to be a naval battle, so this is going to take place on the oceans. And the Battle of Trafalgar is important because at this battle, the British fleet is going to destroy a combined French and Spanish fleet. We're skipping over a lot of stuff here, but by this time, Napoleon has conquered Spain, has put a relative on the throne of Spain, and so France and Spain are kind of working in tandem. This is a big deal in terms of Napoleonic history, and this ends any threat that Napoleon had to invade England. Now, again, is Napoleon going to invade England? Is a scholarly debate here, whether it would have been practical, whether it's pie in the sky thinking, or whether it's item number 15 on a 100-piece list here. But Britain now no longer has to deal with the threat of Napoleon going and attacking and taking over Britain. They can kind of sit back and worry about other things, do that way. So in the short term, that's what the Battle of Trafalgar does. In the grand scheme of things, the Battle of Trafalgar is gigantically important as we move from the 19th century into the 20th century, because the effect of the Battle of Trafalgar is that the British are going to assume naval dominance in the world. The really only fleet in 1805 that could have challenged the British on the high seas is, for the most part, sent to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at the Battle of Trafalgar, allowing Britain to be the unrivaled, dominant naval power of the world. And so for the rest of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, Britain is going to be the king of the seas. There's not going to be a single power that's going to be able to challenge them on the open ocean. And it is no surprise that the British Empire only grows during the next, say, 100, 15, 120 years. Because of this battle. This is a huge thing that happens. After, say, the Battle of Austerlitz, the third coalition is going to be formed against France. So again, coalitions are forming or going for this. This third coalition is Austria, Russia, Sweden, and France, go up there, and then they're going to be defeated at the Battle of Austerlitz. Again, if we're talking about Napoleonic history, Austerlitz is one of his great victories. It's not a military history class. We don't have time to go into it by too much. And then the Battle of Ulm by Napoleon's Grand Armée, or the Army of France. As Napoleon is conquering eastward, he's going to begin to abolish many of these German states and the Holy Roman Empire. He takes one look at these thousands of bishoprics and duchies and counties and principalities and burghers with their burgermeisters in Germany and says, this is crazy, this is wild, this is nuts. And he goes and begins consolidating a lot of these German states. So where you might have several hundred in the year, say 1790, by the time we get to 1815, there's maybe 40 or 50. And this is a major step towards eventual German unification. Right? If you ask a random German today how they feel about Napoleon, they're not going to feel too great about him. But again, it's one of those great ironies of history that one of the great forces for unification of Germany, for Germany existing, was the French Emperor Napoleon going and trying to bring some sort of legislative and imperial organization to this hodgepodge group of states that had been that way since the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1640s. Now, again, the Battle of Trafalgar is a big deal in the short term because it ends the threat of, at least ostensibly, a French invasion of England. And again, if we get to 1805, Napoleon is won in Italy, he's won in France, he's won in Austria. He keeps winning all these battles, and on land, he seems to be unbeatable and invincible. He's taking on giant armies, and his France is coming away victorious time and time again. So for the English, this becomes a threat of what is Napoleon going to do next, and it very much that Napoleon has his sights set on England. So pictures like this start to be published in England, talking about the threat of a Napoleonic invasion of the country, the island country of England. All right, so what's France going to do? How are they going to get to England? Are they going to build a tunnel underneath the English Channel, which some people thought? Are they going to build this huge giant? So again, those are little guys down there to give you a sense of scale. Big giant troop transports out of science fiction kind of novels and ideas to go and do this. Mothers are telling their children, eat your vegetables or Napoleon's going to come steal you in the middle of the night. So these are all ideas. This is a threat that is a real threat to the psyche of England. And so that's why they want to make sure that they have the superiority on the high seas so that any French invasion fleet would be met by this British ships sunk and sent away. So that's why the Battle of Trafalgar becomes such a big deal. Now, this is going to take place off the coast of southwestern Spain, and this is where we'll get to the laser pointer out. The British forces under the HMS Victory with Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson at the lead on the combined Spanish and French fleets. Now, the wind in this case is a big deal for this battle because, again, these are all sailing ships, so you move by the wind. So what Nelson does, and this is his famous, we're going to do a little naval history, he's going to do his famous crossing the T maneuver. So we have the French and Spanish forces going northwards, and with the wind at their back, and again, if you know your naval lingo, with what's called the weather gauge, the British are going to try to do this. Now, this is a gamble by Nelson. All right? It's a gamble by Nelson in that, remember, your cannons on most of your big, huge, giant ships of the line are facing sideways. So you're going and allowing the Spanish and the French to have the first volley, the first salvo in this battle by shooting at your guys. But you're offering them a narrower target, and at least initially, because you're coming at them head on. These boats are very long, but they're not very wide. So by going straight at them, you're offering a narrower target, so it's harder to hit. And Nelson's gamble is that by crossing through the middle of this line, he's going to allow his ships to be able to fire their broadsides into the sails and to the rudders of the Spanish and French, as well as cause these ships to flee and scatter, which then allows the British to be able to team up and go and attack them. So this is one of the great naval maneuvers from naval history. It's still studied by naval war colleges today. It's that big of a deal. And so again, Horatio Nelson is at the front in the HMS Victory for the British. He's going to be shot from the rigging of a French ship by a sniper, so he's not going to survive the battle. But the HMS Victory does, and you can go walk on it in England today. So this is a big, important naval battle. Again, it becomes a huge part of the what it means to be British. There's a Trafalgar Square with a 30-foot tall pillar with Admiral Horatio Nelson at the top of it in the middle of London. So this is a huge, big deal for them. So this is a big victory for Britain at sea, which we can contrast with victory after victory that Napoleon is winning on land. So this is a famous painting of Napoleon victorious after the Battle of Austerlitz, which is probably one of his more famous victories that he's able to go and do. He divides his forces. He's taking on a much larger army. It's a great piece of generalship and leadership during this time period. But again, not a military history class, so we got to move on. 1807, the Prussian and Russian forces combine to try to attack Napoleon, and Napoleon promptly defeats them at the big giant battles of Jena and Auerstadt. Right? After the Battle of Auerstadt, with the Russian forces defeated, the Russians and Napoleon go and meet to hammer out a peace treaty. And this peace treaty is called the Treaty of Tilsit. And what this does is going to redraw the map of Europe, which basically puts Napoleon as the de facto ruler of Europe, at least continental Europe, as Russia is now going to ally with France. So from the Atlantic coast in Portugal through Moscow, from Belgium down to the Italian peninsula in Europe, Napoleon is the de facto leader, either directly or through allies or family members that he's putting on the thrones of these countries that he's kicking off there. The only country that's left then is Great Britain. So how does Napoleon go and fight Great Britain? Well, again, the timeline is important here. 1807 is 2 years removed from the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon has no fleet to attack Britain. So how does Napoleon go attack what he calls a nation of shopkeepers? He attacks them where it's going to hurt them the most, their pocketbooks. So he creates what's called the Continental System. The Continental System basically is an economic war against Great Britain. Napoleon cannot bring the English army to battle. I cannot bring them to field by getting them to invade Europe to where he can destroy them, and Britain's not is smart enough to not give him that chance. He's going to go attack them in their pocketbooks. And basically what he does is for all intents and purposes, closes the European ports to British goods. You can kind of visualize this as Napoleon putting up kind of a virtual fence all around the European continent where Great Britain cannot sell its goods in these European ports. And as we'll get into our next unit on the Industrial Revolution, Britain is making a ton of stuff at this time period. But remember, it does you no good to make something as a business if you're then not going to be able to sell it. So that's kind of what Napoleon is trying to do here. We're going to pause and just highlight here that this is Napoleon at the height of its power. From 1807 to 1810, the French Empire is at its height, at its largest extent, at the greatest kind of peaks of its power that it has in there. This is Napoleon as the conqueror of Europe. Now, the Treaty of Tilsit is a little bit interesting in that if you can kind of pay attention to what's going on in the picture, and we'll show you another one, it's drawn up in the middle of the river. The Russians didn't want to give in to Napoleon even a little bit, so they decided they're going to draw the line, the Treaty of Tilsit, down the middle of this river, because if they let Napoleon come to the other side of the river, he was going to draw the line on that side of the river. And that would give him pretext to keep going. So that a little bit interesting on the backstory that again, the Russian emperor and Napoleon meet in the middle of this river on a raft to hammer out this treaty to kind of go and do that. So again, that's what the Treaty of Tilsit is going to do in terms of redrawing the map of Europe. And what it allows Napoleon to do is then create the continental system, where again, allies from the Atlantic Ocean all the way through to Moscow makes Napoleon the de facto ruler of Europe, except for Great Britain in across the English Channel. So how does Napoleon attack a island nation without a fleet? He goes and attacks them by attacking them in their pocketbooks. Right? So he creates the continental system, which effectively goes and creates a fence around Europe and makes it so Britain cannot sell anything in these ports. It's closed for business. Any British ships are sent back or their stuff is seized. So ostensibly trying to hit Britain where it's going to hurt them the most. So let's see how this goes. All right. So if we're paying attention, ooh, looks like something has changed down here at the bottom. It's good PowerPointing. So what then eventually is going to lead to the defeat of Napoleon? If this is Napoleon at the height of his power, what then is going to make him have to lose? So the defeat of Napoleon comes down to two major factors. One, Great Britain survives, and Great Britain is going to be that proverbial thorn in the side of Napoleon. And by Britain surviving through the Battle of Trafalgar, through other means, through the extent of its global empire, that is going to eventually lead to the major downfall of Napoleon, as well as the issue of nationalism, which again we'll spell out in a little bit more detail in our next unit after we finish this presentation. So how do we go and see this? Where do we see this? We see this combined in two ways. Well, one, in 1808, we have the Peninsular War. This is where Spanish guerrillas, no, not gorillas, the great apes of the Central Africa, but guerrillas, right, were aided by the British. Guerrillas were irregular forces. So you're looking at regular guys, so not anybody a professional army. So they're wearing regular clothes, but they're still attacking the French. So it's hard to find out who's on in the army, who's not. They're aided by the British first in terms of money, then in terms of money and guns, then in terms of money, guns, and British soldiers. And these guys were able to harass the French in Spain, force the French to commit more and more forces to Spain, which caused it to have to move stuff around, which again kind of bled the the peninsula in this case of the Peninsular War being the Iberian Peninsula, and so that's what the British are able to do. The next major thing, and the biggest thing that's going to lead to the defeat of Napoleon, is his 1812 French invasion of Russia. And basically, this is going to come down to Napoleon being defeated by Russian nationalism. Now, you're saying, Mr. Cranmer, didn't we just drop the Treaty of Tilsit, where Russia and France are allies? And we did. But again, timeline's important. 5 years have gone by. If Britain cannot trade with Europe, that's not good for Britain, but it's also not good for the economy of Europe. And so over time, this continental system, again, it's no one's really being helped by the continental system. It's starting to wear down on people. So Russia begins in secret, then in kind of more drastic and more flagrant violations of the continental system begins trading with Great Britain, and Napoleon says, no, I can't allow that. So he goes and he amasses a giant invasion force, and he goes and he invades into Russia in the summer of 1812. Now, when we're talking about this, an important thing to talk about that we've hit several times throughout the year is this idea of logistics, and that anybody can be an armchair general and move plastic guys around on a battlefield and come up with all these great maneuvers. But true generals study what's called logistics. And if you want to go make $1 million, go get a degree in logistics for any business today. And so an army is going to march on its stomach. It is a age-old tale of it doesn't matter what you do on the battlefield if you can't get your guys healthy and and prepared and organized and equipped on that battlefield. So how can you be able to get your army to these different places here? So this is going to be something to kind of keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about this. Now, the French Grand Armée, all right, the Grand Army of France, enters Russia in the summer of 1812 with 650,000 men. Now, the quiz, the final's not going to ask you for that number, but we understand this is a giant number. We're going to give you the starting number, so which is going to make the ending number be that more drastic. Now, the Russians have been beaten leftward, upwards, rightwards, downwards for a decade by Napoleon. So the Russians understand that toe to toe, Napoleon and the French army is a better qualitative army than the Russians have. But what the Russians do have is Russian geography and the giganticness of its space. So the Russians are going to practice total war, and they're going to put in place what they call their scorched earth policy. And this is a very straightforward definition, so straightforward, I'm not going to even give you to it. Basically, they burn and destroy everything that is in front of the French army entering in Russia and behind the Russian army as it retreats farther and farther into the hinterland. So they're burning any towns and villages, poisoning wells, leaving booby traps, making so that the French are walking into a wasteland. You can conquer this territory, but what good is it if you're conquering a desert? Now remember, go back up to this point, an army marches on its stomach. There are no MREs, meals ready to eat. There are no airplanes to drop in supplies. There's no pipelines of food. There's nothing. The French are entering Russia with the food that they are carrying and expecting to be able to eat the spoils of the harvest. That's why they're going in the summertime, so that they can start eating all of their way like a horde of vast swarm of locusts through Russia. The Russians say, how are you going to eat our food if that food is burnt to the ground? And so they keep marching and marching and marching farther and farther into Russia. Napoleon gets to Moscow. Okay, he gets to Moscow, and what does he find? Nothing. Finds the emperor has left, finds the government is gone. You can't destroy Russia in a great age of absolute monarchs without capturing or killing or destroying the Russian the Tsar. So he finds there. When he gets to Russia and gets to Moscow in about October of 1812, and again, it's Russia, it's 1812, the temperatures are dropping. Either the French is what the Russians say, or the Russians is what the French say. Someone starts a fire in Moscow, and most of Moscow is burnt to the ground. So Napoleon, sitting into the burnt out crisp of Russia, and as the French have eaten every last bit of food on their way into Moscow, are now looking at the temperatures begin to drop, have no army to find, and are losing its effectiveness. Napoleon decides to retreat. Now, importantly, he retreats on the same path that he came into Russia on. There already is no food given to them by the Russians. They've already eaten anything that they find, and now they're walking back out as the temperatures begin to drop and drop and drop. So the Russians and general winter, the cold temperatures, inflict one of the greatest military disasters in the history of the world. Napoleon enters Russia with 650,000 men. He's going to leave Russia with just 40,000. Typhus, the battles that the Russian army is doing, the Russians nipping at the heels of the retreating French army, as well as the cold, bitterly cold temperatures, take this giant army and leave Napoleon with nothing. So as we talked about, again, this idea of nationalism, we see this very much flare up in Spain. This is Francisco Goya's The 8th of May, 1808. And kind of what we see here is Goya using painting as propaganda. Our French soldiers, we can't see them. They're faceless. They're these kind of stormtrooper from Star Wars, automatrons, these nameless bad guys in the dark firing at these helpless, we can see that they've got no guns or anything on them, Spanish people, right? We're bathed in white, not only white light, but in white clothes, kind of making these guys martyrs. And so this is the treatment that, again, the French are doing to their conquered peoples that has people become more and more upset with them. So on the move farther into history, this is Napoleon entering into Russia. So again, he's marching into Russia on a line of march towards Moscow, and he's fighting giant battles. The Battle of Smolensk, which is here, the Battle of Borodino. These are big, huge, giant nation survival battles that are huge just in and of itself, but they're part of a larger context of a march towards Moscow that Napoleon is in there. It's the Battle of Smolensk. There's Borodino again, and then we get to Moscow. So Napoleon gets to Moscow, but again, importantly, there is no czar. There is no government. Moscow is being burnt to the ground. Again, it doesn't matter who did it. That it's now October. The temperatures are beginning to drop. There is no Russian czar to capture, so Napoleon makes the fateful decision to go back home. And as he's going back home, you can kind of see he leaves on the same line of march that he entered into Russia. Russia is destroying everything that's in here, setting it all on fire. So on the way out, Napoleon has nothing to be able to go eat. The Russian army that's used to these temperatures is on his heels, and this giant army gets whittled down to nothing as the temperatures begin to drop, as the snow begins to uh, fall, as the ice begins to form. And again, so there are stories of the French soldiers stopping on the march for 5, 10 minutes, right? And then guys going to take a step forward when they say start marching again and running into dead soldiers frozen in place in front of them. Now, the big killer of the French army is typhus, all right? And you can kind of feel the cold and the wind in there. Typhus is a disease that's spread by body lice, kind of gets into your blood. It's pretty deadly. You don't want this. If you're a lice, it's pretty cold here in Russia. You want to find something to be able to go warm yourself as a bug on, but not supposed to eat the blood. If the Russians have killed all the animals to deny them to the French, well, then the only thing that's left are these French soldiers. The French soldiers describe situations like this where they're huddled up with their greatcoats and their coats over them in the snow and the rain and not being able to uh, get any sort of comfort because their bodies are literally crawling with all the lice that they have on them because they're being harried and harassed so much that they can't change their clothes, they can't bathe, they can't wash. And so Napoleon is very much destroyed. And what we get out of Napoleon's invasion of France is one of the great and one of the first true infographics in all of world history. So this is a design here. We'll give you the English version. And basically what we're showing here is the thickness of the French army when it goes and enters into Moscow. And again, it's fighting big giant battles of Vilna and Smolensk and Borodino. And you can kind of see it getting whittled down as they're fighting all their way here into Moscow. And then they go and retreat on the way back. Now, importantly here, let's take a look at the temperatures. It's 32 degrees, right? In October when they decide to leave. Then it's -9, -21, -20, -30, right? On December 7th, as they're marching out, that's the air temperature. And we see this giant, thick army that enters into Russia become this tiny, thin little line that goes and leaves Russia in there. So that's one of the big things. So if you're one of these other armies and people throughout all of Europe under the yoke of French rule, you're going to see and smell blood in the water here. So in 1813, patriots all across Europe call for a war of liberation against the France, and they go and they descend on a tiny, small French army as Napoleon is running his way back to Versailles to try to figure some out. In 1814, with Napoleon surrounded by this giant coalition of foreign governments, he surrenders, gives the jig up, he abdicates the throne, he gives it up, and he goes and he's banished to the island of Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. The French monarchy and Louis the 18th is restored. So if we're following along here in our timeline of the French Revolution, we started with an absolute monarch. We had the National Assembly and the Convention, the Committee of Public Safety, the Directory, consulships, Napoleonist council, Napoleonist empire, and then we've come all the way back now to an absolute monarchy here in France. Now, the important thing here is that Louis the 18th is not as charismatic, he's not as popular as Napoleon. He's older, he is ugly, he is crippled. So he just does not have that X factor, that it factor, that ability to hold the imaginations of the French people as Napoleon does. So people begin in France saying, "Ah, wouldn't it be great if Napoleon came back? And man, we miss our buddy Napoleon." So in 1815, Napoleon escapes. He's smuggled out by a group of loyal soldiers on a boat out of Elba, gets to the Italian mainland, and his army flocks to him. This is the 100 Days campaign, as his old soldiers run into their footlockers and grab their uniforms and their guns and flock to their emperor, and people begin coming out of the woodwork and supporting him, and Napoleon marches on Paris and regains power and then begins to say, I'm going to go and bring back the glory that I just lost, begins going and marching out there as the other European nations are going, whoa, what's going on, and trying as quick as they possibly can to be able to go and throw forces at Napoleon to stop him from regaining all the power that they just wrestled from him. So this is going to come to a head on June 18th of 1815, where British and Prussian forces, led by the Duke of Wellington on the British side, are going to fight Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo is in modern-day Belgium. This is one of the most studied battles in all of military history. This is a huge kind of place of residence in the British psyche, as the British, with the Prussians coming kind of to save the day later in a decisive moment in the battle, are able to defeat Napoleon once and for all. The people of Europe are no longer going to mess around with Napoleon. They're not sending him to a Mediterranean island. This time they're going to send him to a spit of rock in the middle of the Atlantic, to St. Helena, where one boat comes once a month to deliver food and the mail. And that's where Napoleon is going to stay until he dies of stomach cancer after this. So the island of Elba here is off the coast of Italy. So again, 20, 30 kilometers, it's swimmable for a decent open sea swimmer. So it's not too far. And so that's going to, again, it's a Mediterranean island. Napoleon's from Corsica. This is not like, this is white collar prison. This is not like maximum security. So he's able to escape, and then which is going to again lead to the 100 Days campaign. The British go and meet him at Waterloo. This is what a British soldier would have carried and with him when he met Napoleon. And again, this is a giant battle that's broken down kind of minute by minute by historians. It's very well studied. It inspires great works of art, like here with the charge of the Royal Scot Greys from the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's famous cavalry charges are repulsed by the British soldiers forming squares. Be able to do that, and again, we could talk forever. We could do a whole history semester class just on the Battle of Waterloo if you wanted. But the important thing for our class is Napoleon loses at Waterloo. So hints, winks, and nudges. Why is the Battle of Waterloo a big deal? For your quiz here is that Napoleon loses, and this ends once and for all Napoleon's power in Europe. So he's going to be exiled to the small little spit of rock, St. Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic, and that's where Napoleon is going to stay and finish out his days. So as we're finishing up here, the question becomes, Napoleon's conquered all of France. With the Congress of Vienna, is all going to be about how we're picking up the pieces of what Napoleon has done here. So one country, France, one man, Napoleon, one revolution, the French Revolution, isn't going to immediately change Europe. So the Congress of Vienna is going to project this liberal change brought about by the French Revolution and embrace a conservative restoration of power. The Congress of Vienna is led by and organized by Prince Clemens Wenzel von Metternich, and who wants the Congress to emphasize the use of diplomacy to help keep the peace in Europe. For centuries in Europe, privilege has equaled power, and that's really not going to change overnight. And that's what the Congress of Vienna is set on doing, of restoring the conservative powers back to their thrones that Napoleon has kicked off and kind of tried to change here. So this is our buddy Metternich. So he's the one in charge. And again, you can get pictures like this where you can go see all the 40 different princes and kings and diplomats who come to Vienna to try to hammer out what the world is that they're going to make out of this. So out of the Congress of Vienna, we're going to get kind of the last 4 or 5 things on our study guide here. Is some of the important things that come out of this include the principle of legitimacy. So the Congress of Vienna sets up this principle that the legitimate rulers should return to the thrones from which Napoleon evicted them. So a classic example is Napoleon invaded Portugal. The Portuguese king fled back to his new world colony of Brazil, and then the Congress of Vienna says, "Why don't you go and come back and become the leader of Portugal again?" Right, so we're putting those conservative rulers, the absolute rulers, back in place from whence they were kicked off. The Congress of Vienna creates the Holy Alliance, where Austria, the German state, Prussia, and Russia all insulate themselves together against France to form a giant counterweight of an allied forces in the east against the powerful French country in the middle of Europe. The concert of Europe is also a major idea of this, which plays off the Holy Alliance, where the Holy Alliance is just one of a series of alliances designed to balance the power of Europe and suppress revolutions, balancing the power of the different nations so that one nation isn't too powerful to where it can be like France and conquer all of Europe and try to suppress any of these revolutions that might bubble up of this virus of revolution that the French Revolution is caused for the conservative powers of Europe. So that's kind of what you're going and doing. And the Metternich system is going to be a system that's going to use force, censorship, and spies to keep this balance intact. If you like James Bond or spy stories, one of the great ages of spycraft is what happens in the years of the 1800s after the Congress of Vienna, as all the European countries are trying to gain influence and information to try to be able to keep tabs on and keep power in Europe to keep everything balanced. Now the question becomes, does this work? And the answer is, in one sense, it does. Europe has wars in the 1800s, but there is not a giant continental-wide war like we saw with the Napoleonic Wars until the First World War. Right? So again, that's 100 years of relative peace and prosperity. That sounds good, but it also then sets the stage for one of the worst conflicts ever in world history up until that point. So it becomes kind of this double-edged sword here. So that's going to finish all what we're talking about here. So Europe in 1815 becomes kind of similar to what we saw of Europe in, say, 1800, but the big change here is in Central Europe as we start to see less of these tiny little pinpricks of color and more of these giant states that are coming out of Central Europe because the Holy Roman Empire has been abolished. A lot of these German states have been consolidated, and this is moving towards a unification of Germany, which is going to have huge implications as we move into the 20th century. All of these different nations are able to play off each other through the balance of power, which again, everyone's trying to be able to set alliances and work with each other economically, politically, and militarily to keep all the countries on the same level playing field so we don't have another Napoleon rise up and take things over.